Who are you?
So, who are you? And we're here at Adobe.
Yeah.
So thanks for inviting me up.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming.
So
yeah.
who are you, though?
My name's John Knack. I'm one of the product managers on Photoshop.
Photoshop.
And yeah.
That's like a famous Adobe product, right?
Yeah, it's a small niche product, you know. We hope it'll get some users someday. Yeah, it's great. It's a lot of fun. It's huge, though, you know, both in terms of just being a big mature app and also in terms of the number of people using it. So it's really kind of fun but challenging to strike a balance there. And how do you make it easier yet more powerful? You know, techier for some people who need that, yet more approachable. So, yeah, it's a cool endeavor.
Well, it's one of the applications that's become part of our culture, right? When we see a photo that's been altered in some way, we say it's photoshopped, right?
Right. Yeah.
Even though we don't even know that really it was photoshopped. That did it, right?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because once you know what's possible with digital manipulation, I think you start looking at the world differently. And you know, looking at a photo that maybe it's just odd lighting, and it really is a completely legitimate photo, but with a certain suspicion. And I was telling my wife that it's, I don't know if it's a good commentary or a bad one, but whenever we're working on certain features, I start looking at the world and just wanting to apply those features live. So I'll look at the sky and say, like, you know, a shadow highlight would really sort that out, you know, like you really. Yeah. And so we were at dinner last night, and I was looking at various things and thinking, if we had this feature, see, I could really do that. So, yeah.
Now, how many photographers are in the Photoshop team?
That's a good question. I would say easily a majority of the people on the team take a fair number of photos. And one of the fun things about being on the team is, so we've got the Camera Raw plugin, and every time a new camera comes out, we have to get a copy and test against it. So we end up with this locker of every camera body you can imagine. So everything from the little point and shoot guys up to, you know, 1DS Mark II. And so it's really nice that on the weekends or whenever you can borrow the camera gear. So I was playing with this crazy like 5x macro lens, and
well, you got to come out on our photo walking, because Thomas Hawk and I go out, and every couple of weeks we do a photo walk.
I've heard of that. Yeah, I'd like to. I'm a total rank amateur. A lot of these guys are a lot more skilled, but I think that's one of the fun things about this product is that, you know, sometimes I joke with my wife because it's like, you know, I work all the time, and yet before I worked here, I would come home and work on Photoshop, you know, just as a hobby, and it was fun. And so now the fact that I do that, it's like, well, now you're working too much. And whereas before it was like, no, see, you work and then you have interests. And now it's like, well, they're kind of run together. Yeah. But the cool part is that a lot of the people on the team are users as well. And so, you know, somebody will be like, hey, I just went to England and the skies were all white and they were all clipped, and can we do something about that? So yeah, it's sort of a neat, people kind of, it's the old eat your own dog food kind of thing.
How many people do you know worked in regular old chemical darkrooms back in the 80s? Or
yeah, I know.
Because a lot of the tools in Photoshop actually, the images, the icons you use come from the old
That's right.
chemical darkroom phase.
That's right. It would be interesting to quiz users and see how many know, like, that lollipop thing, you know, for dodging. Like, what, you know, that's, I think it's, and this is me betraying my inexperience, because I've been in a darkroom, but I've never done anything serious. I think it's actually like a little paddle, you know, so you could block out where the light would hit. Yeah. That's a good question. I know certainly Thomas Knoll, who is one of the brothers who started the product, has always been a serious photographer. And in fact, Camera Raw came about largely because he was on vacation about 5 years ago and was shooting with his camera and just hated the software that came with it. So in Italy, downloaded the SDK and wrote himself a RAW converter. And I was like, yeah, but I could do that. I was like, yeah. You know, and suddenly it became this thing that the majority of pro photographers in the world use. So it's, yeah. So yeah, it's all.
Does Thomas come into the office and work here? We're here in the Adobe skyscraper.
That's right. That's right.
Downtown San Jose, California.
Yeah. So we're in San Jose. He actually lives in Michigan, and what's kind of funny is he's a private pilot. So he has his own little, I don't know if it's like a little Cessna or Piper Cub or something that he'll fly over here with, and I'm from the Midwest myself, and so, you know, it's kind of like try to keep it real, be frugal. and obviously Thomas has been really successful, you know, with the product, and yet he'll still fly through Reno because the hotels are cheaper there, and it's just kind of, it's really charming because, you know, he is that guy. He's just a really smart technical dude, and you know, whether he's doing it for himself or he's doing it for a couple million people, it's sort of, it doesn't seem to change him. So that's kind of funny.
This was probably a big week in your team's history, right? You guys just shipped CS3.
That's right. Yeah. So we shipped. I think about midnight on Sunday. We announced that we're shipping, and then I was at NAB for a few days this week. So that was a big coming out for Photoshop Extended. So for the first time we're doing video and 3D and HDR imaging and so
HDR imaging. That's
yeah.
What is that?
So
I know what it is.
You know, sure.
I read the Adobe blog, so
right.
But it's actually pretty cool. But.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It gets used in a couple ways, and so most people.
Explain what it is.
Sure.
Who...
So most people, when you take an image, like you have a JPEG, it's an 8-bit image, and so you've got 8 bits of data in the red, the green, and the blue channels. So that gives you, just a certain level of precision, and when you start to really change the brightness and the contrast and things, you can start getting artifacts. So a lot of cameras have started sampling higher numbers of bits, and so 10 or 12 in RAW, and so you can work in 16-bit in Photoshop. But you're still working with sort of the same thing with just a much finer scale. High dynamic range, or 32-bit imaging, really kind of blows the doors off that, and you have essentially an unlimited, okay, I should qualify this. So I'm a history major. So if I misspeak here, please don't take it as the Photoshop team doesn't know what they're talking about. It's just me, not being a big math guy. But basically, you've got an unlimited dynamic range. So you could have a single image that would have the sun and a candle in it, and there's no way to expose for that and just have one exposure. But in Photoshop, you get this 32-bit file. You can actually slide an exposure slider and see one versus the other. So for photographers, with a few exceptions of really high-end equipment, there's really no way to capture these images directly. So what people do is they'll set up a tripod, and they'll take a bunch of bracketed shots. So let's see, the classic example is like you go into the Stanford Memorial Chapel.
And bracketing means you take one that's maybe 2 stops brighter and then 1 stop brighter.
Exactly, and then right on. Exactly, and so like if you're in a cathedral or something, you'd want to expose at one end, really stop down and get, you'd want to get the shadows, and then you get the highlights on the other end. What you can then do in Photoshop is there's a command merge to HDR, and it takes all these lower bit depth images and makes this one 32-bit file. And then from there, you can do a couple things. You can either tone map it and sort of squeeze it down to be 8 or 16, so you can see the really bright stuff and the really dark stuff, but in one image. Or if you're doing like 3D and film work, sometimes they'll take those images and they'll feed them into 3D software, because that way you've essentially sampled a map of the lights in the environment, and that can be used to light your 3D objects.
Wow.
So that's where Photoshop CS3 Extended is kind of new, because for those folks you can actually now draw and paint in HDR. But it's kind of a trippy thing, because depending on where you've set the exposure, you sample red and it might be black or it might be white, sort of just depending on how much exposure you're looking. I can kind of show you. It's definitely kind of bleeding edge for most people. But I think it's something that a lot of photographers are interested in, because, like, if you think even...
Well, we've always been interested in that, right? Ansel Adams had the zone system,
sure,
which was a way for him to expose, really bright stuff like snow, along with really deep shadow detail in a tree shadow, right, in the same scene.
And he was obviously masterful at that, and that's what makes images so compelling like that. And I don't think people look at it consciously and know why it's so cool, but they just, it's as you scan around, you can see all those details.
Yeah.
So, a real simple example is you go into a building and there's somebody near a window, and you can't really simultaneously get the person and get what's out the window.
Yeah.
you know, because your camera just doesn't have the range for it.
No, and in fact, that's my first rule of video, is always sit with the window behind the camera.
Totally, yeah.
Because if I aim into the window, everything gets dark. Right?
Exactly, or you know, you'll see that the camera's trying to compensate on the fly.
Even though the view out the window is pretty cool. But then I wouldn't see your face.
Well,
right?
yeah, I'm very proud. It took me 6.5 years to get a window, so I'm all jazzed about that. So I can see scenic San Jose Airport from here. But yeah, it's pretty cool. So you can actually, you know, take these, you know, these slices and then build them into this one continuous tone image. So yeah, there's a lot of places where, I mean, the challenge with Photoshop, you've got an app that's been in the market for 17 years, so it's, you know, incredibly mature. People say, you know, what else could you add? So for us, we're kind of trying to go in two directions. It's trying to do the just really meat and potato stuff and do it better. So making selections, running filters, using more RAM, like all that stuff. And at the same time, can we be pushing and redefining what's possible? So things that people didn't even think of, like HDR, can we make that really accessible? So it's kind of a neat trick to try to work those things in without just making it look like a 747 cockpit, you know.
What the trend in cameras right now is about a 10 to 14 megapixel SLR for the high end SLRs, and on the low end the phones are getting to 5 megapixels now. Right?
Yeah, it's amazing. You know, it was like for SLRs, it was sort of like this magic $1,000 price point, and they blew past that a couple years ago. Now it seems to be heading more towards $500. Yeah. So I think like a Nikon D40 was 6 megapixels, and now it's 10. You know, and so just the amount of data that's out there is pretty breathtaking. I think the thing that people will realize is a couple of things. It's one, there's only so much blood you can get out of a stone, right? And so it's like if you've got a cell phone or whatever, and you've got this little peanut-sized sensor, sure, you can blow it up, but the amount of light hitting it is pretty low, and so the noise is going to be pretty high. So I think people at some point will realize that more is not necessarily better. Sometimes bigger pixels themselves are a good thing. And also... Yeah,
like the Canon 5D that Thomas Hawk uses is a full-frame sensor. Yeah. So his wide-angle lenses actually stay wide-angle.
I know. That thing is it's really cool. Some of the guys on our team have those, and it's amazing. You know, you go to a party or something, and they can be shooting at really high ISOs, and still the noise is super, super low, because you've really just got that much more sensor material to capture the light and do the processing. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
What's new in CS3? What's hot that's different?
Oh yeah. Well, I always ask people sort of, you know, what do you do? Because a lot of the time, what's interesting to one person might be totally arcane and uninteresting to somebody else. So I can show you. I don't know if you can see my screen.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let me just launch Photoshop here. So I was saying before you started recording that people always ask, you know, what machine is fast enough or what's powerful enough, and it's like, have you ever met a machine that's fast enough?
It's never fast
enough. You know, so I just got this new MacBook and, you know, put 3 gigs of RAM into it, and it's like, that just makes me open more tabs in Safari or have more apps at once. So,
well, everybody should be forced to use Photoshop 1 on a Mac 2, I think. Then they would have some appreciation for the machine you have on your desk.
Well, yeah, it's funny because we think about when the app started, and you know, sometimes you look at, I like to joke sometimes that Photoshop is like a tree, you know, and you slice it and you can count the rings, and you can see sort of when certain things went in, and you're like, oh, there was the fire of '03, you know, and that was like, you know, this is the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and just because the screens were so much smaller, some of the original dialogues, which haven't really needed to change, like, you know, for feathering and things, are yay big, and then you can see, okay, a certain other time, so, you know, things got a bit bigger. So one of the challenges is just to go back and try to look at that stuff with a fresh eye, and to modernize some of the things that could, you know, we could stand to do better now that computers can do so much more on the fly.
Oh, yeah.
So one of the cool things there, and I'll just bring up Bridge, which is a companion product that actually ships in the box with Photoshop, is we were trying to do things more as you work. So one of the cool things is called Quick Select in Photoshop. So once I bring this up, we will just go.
So how are you going through those images? Just with your trackpad?
Yeah, exactly. So I just got a little 2-finger touch here, and so one of the big requests in Bridge is to make things faster, and so we've really worked pretty hard on that. So you can now cruise through stuff really quick. These are all 22 megapixel images, and you can zip around. So performance is always kind of the best possible feature because you don't have to learn anything. It just goes faster. So one of the things that's always been, you mentioned Photoshop 1.0, one of the killer features of that product was that it did soft edge selections.
Yeah.
And that was just this like completely groundbreaking thing. Now it's totally taken for granted, but at the time it was really new stuff. And so selection has always been one of the distinguishing things about Photoshop. And so with this release, we've been looking at a lot of the image research that's going on over the last few years, and we're thinking, well, now that machines have so many cycles, what can we be doing on the fly that's smarter than maybe in the past? And so there's always been a tool, the Magic Wand tool, which I don't know if it's Deke McClelland or somebody likes to joke that it's the Tragic Wand tool. And it's sort of, it's very useful in a lot of cases.
Why do they call it that?
Well, so let me show you. So, so the Magic Wand, the idea is it selects ranges of color. So you give it a certain tolerance, and if I wanted to select this guy's shirt, I could click it, and it selected all of these white pixels. And if I change the range, I can select more or fewer. But a lot of times people will want to do something like select these bricks. So they'll start clicking brick, 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 and that doesn't really work well, and maybe they'll say it's not contiguous, and they'll make a selection, but then it's grabbing part of the guy's face. And so there are definitely limitations to how the tool works.
For people who never used Photoshop before, what you're doing here is selecting things based on the color depth or color intensity.
Exactly, right? Exactly. So when I click on a certain red pixel, it'll find everything that's similar within a certain range of that red pixel.
And you're doing that so you can change the color. For instance, if you want to change the color of the bricks to green, for instance, you need to select all the red bricks.
Yes.
So you can change the color.
That's right. That's right. And so it's a really approachable tool. It's literally grab it and you just start clicking stuff.
Yeah.
But as you get more sophisticated, people have all manner of selection. You can use paths, you can use channels, you can use color range. And so to get a really sophisticated selection, a lot of people sort of shy away from that. So what we wanted was to come up with a tool that had the same ease of use, but which was hopefully more sophisticated and a bit smarter. So what we have next to the Magic Wand is this thing called the Quick Selection tool.
And where is that in the palette?
It's actually in the same bucket as the Magic Wand. And in fact, it's selected by default. We were trying to make it a little easier to find.
All right.
And so the way the Quick Select works is it's also sampling a range, but it's looking at more than just the color. So one of the more processor-intensive things to do is actually look at things like texture and shape on the fly. So when I want to select this guy, what I'm going to do is just start clicking in his hair and painting, and these little dotted lines are the edges of my selection. So as I click and paint on this guy, the Quick Selection tool is using this graph cut technology under the hood, and which has been a sort of an image science breakthrough in the last few years. And what you should be seeing is that was all with one click and drag on my trackpad. It went and selected around the guy. And so even though his skin tone and his jeans and his shirt are very different colors, it's looking for sort of cohesive regions of pixels. And so it's looking, comparing the texture of his skin to the background, for example.
Yeah.
Now, if you look a little bit more closely, let me zoom in so you can see this. Now, there are some cases where it made some mistakes. So here it jumped a little too far into the background. And so that's sort of inevitable to some extent. And luckily, it's pretty easy to fix. So there are various little options you can choose up here, or you can just hold down the Option key or Alt on Windows. And I can just click and paint, and actually, when I hold down Alt or Option, it removes. Yeah. So just clicking adds, and then this reverses it. So he's got this little dorsal fin going on here, and I can just click on that and paint that away, and add to this region with his eye. So we wanted to make something that was really sort of
really cool.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, really kind of gestural and intuitive. And the other nice thing is it's not sort of a tool in isolation. It's not like do this or do something else. This is just sort of another...
So you can switch back to the regular magic
Absolutely.
wand.
Magic wand, lasso.
Which looks at brightness.
Yeah, exactly. So what I often do is I'll do this, and maybe there's some really tricky area, and I'll just take the lasso and I'll just shift click and extend that. You know, so it's just one of the tools that works together. The other thing that's nice, I mentioned things like feathering, which have been there forever. We wanted to go back to that stuff and say, can we try to unite it and group it together and make it more interactive? So we have this little thing called Refine Edge, and you can get this. It's a button on the options bar if you have a selection tool, or it's under the select menu. So I'm just going to choose Refine Edge, and what you'll see is it gives me a preview of my artwork matted against a background. And so I can choose, you know, if I know this is going to go in a magazine on a black spread, I could choose black, I could choose white. I can see the alpha channel. Oh, sure. These are just these little buttons here.
Great.
So you can go sort of a quick mask mode. And so what's cool about this is as you play with the parameters, let me zoom in so you can see this a bit better. If I were to do something like, you know, change the feather, which is the softness of the edge, you're interactively seeing how that's going to look on different backgrounds. You can see this black and white alpha channel is the selection that I'm making. And so it's taking what had been, you know, half a dozen individual commands in Photoshop, putting them all in one dialog, and then making them, adding a live preview. So really just trying to take core things, and you don't have to sort of relearn a lot. You're just, oh, it's doing the same stuff, but now it's much more interactive. And that's the stuff that we can do now that computers are a lot faster, because, you know, 5 years ago maybe this would have been prohibitive. Now it's totally fine on a laptop. Yeah. I have to show you one other example of this thing working, because I think, you know, Refine Edge, it's pretty cool just in a case like this, but let me deviate. I always say the first rule of Demo Club is don't deviate from the demo. And the second rule of Demo Club is don't deviate from the demo. I will now deviate just for a second, and I just want to pull up this this little fire image, and let's open that guy up. Oops, I was just experimenting with something. There we go. Okay, so what I want to do is...
now, how are you making that selection smaller?
So the bracket keys on the keyboard. So as I just type right bracket or left bracket, that controls my brush tip size.
Got it.
So basically anything that's a brush behaves that way. And you can also change the softness with the shift key and brackets.
That's really the key to being a power Photoshop user, isn't it? Learning all the key commands.
Well, you know, to an extent, you're right. In fact, I updated my old boss, Mike Ninnis, who worked here and then at Microsoft and here again, and now he's at lynda.com, wrote a book called Photoshop Power Shortcuts. And so I updated that for Photoshop 7, and yeah, there are, I've lost track, but it's got to be, you know, well into the hundreds, if not pushing 1,000 shortcuts. But just as an aside, I mean, that's one of the things where sometimes Photoshop can feel a little bit like a black art, like it's like Eyes Wide Shut. Everybody's wearing some robe and mask and, you know, chanting, and there's incense. And we're trying to, that's all good, but we're trying to make it a little bit more approachable. And it's, you know, that's great for the power users, but you shouldn't have to know that stuff.
No.
And so it's kind
There's
of
always a menu selection somewhere. It's very inefficient. So when you meet somebody who's really adept at Photoshop, and has been doing it a long time, well, they're just so fast and they move so fast that you can't even follow what they're doing. And you're like,
yeah.
That's why I was asking. I saw the tool shrinking and growing, and I knew somebody would wonder how it's doing.
Right. Well, you know, it's funny because sometimes I'll forget and I'll be demoing and I won't even remember where a given menu item is, and it's like, oh yeah, you know, because you're just so used to it's sort of muscle memory that you do it with the keyboard. Yeah. So just to show you another use of Quick Select and Refine Edge, so I just want to make a really simple selection of this fire, and one of the
you're not clicking, you're just moving that selection point around, and
so what I'll do, so I'll just drag it over here, and then I click, and it just kind of fills out to grab that fire. And this is, again, something that would be kind of challenging with the Magic Wand, potentially. And it's trying to make sort of cohesive groups. So I'm not going to worry about selecting every bit of this. I'll just go and grab these little bits. But what you'll see, let me zoom out just a little bit, is now when I go into Refine Edge, and I pull this up, I've got, okay, I selected the fire, but it's sort of a challenging thing because you got this really wispy stuff. And this is one of those things that sort of bedevils the computer science guys who try to make this stuff work. Well, what we have now is this radius slider. And what's cool about this, I've had it technically described to me. Obviously it didn't stick. I just think of it as sort of a wispiness. And so if you've got like fur or hair or fire, you'll notice as I slide this higher and higher, it starts knocking out these pieces in the middle. And so if your viewers are interested, I can try to get you a more technical explanation. But
you're messing with that radius slider at the top.
Yeah, and then also, to make it a little clearer, you can actually see this black and white representation of what is selected versus what's not. You can play with that, and then you can also play with the contrast. So you get more of these midtones, or if you want to make it a bit more punchy, and you can see it previewed against different backgrounds. And so, that's before, and that's after. And so if I then want to make that its own layer, I just hit first I hit OK, then I hit Command J, that jumps it to its own layer, and then I hide the background, and now I have that fire. So Refine Edge is actually, it's sort of, I think, maybe deceptively simple. It's sort of, if people want to use it for just the basic, expand, contract, feather, that's totally cool. It's interactive. It's one spot. But it really has some new things, too, that are kind of...
To a new photographer who's never played with Photoshop before, the layers, I think, are one of the more confusing things. Because we're not used to seeing our photographs as layers and layers and layers of things built on top of each other. Can you explain a little bit about how layering works, and has there been any improvements in CS3 to how layers work, or how you work with layers?
Sure. So it's interesting you mention it, because this is one of the big sort of philosophical debates we're going through right now. So it's interesting, Photoshop 1.0 through version 2.5, there were no layers whatsoever.
Yep. So
everything was a totally flat sheet. And like you say, to a photographer, that's sort of how you're used to thinking, and you could select things and all, but Photoshop's evolution's been interesting because even though it's been intended for thing X, it gets used for Y and Z and Q and R. And so a lot of graphic artists and other folks wanted to start making composites. So you've got two layers and you want to move them around relative to each other. And so you could do that in the first versions, but as soon as you would hit click off, they would just commit and they would be fused together. So with layers, you've essentially got multiple documents all stacked on each other. And so if you're doing something like web design or graphics work, it becomes really essential to be able to, you've got multiple pieces of text, you've got some widgets and sliders and radio buttons, and you want to keep all that stuff separate.
Or a logo, for instance.
Absolutely.
If your boss all of a sudden comes to you and says, "Oh, our logo is no longer green; it's red," and you've flattened it into the image, there's not you have to do a lot of work to tear the logo out.
That's right.
And then put another one back in.
Exactly.
Or and if it's separated on a layer, all you do is mess with the logo layer, and away you go.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, to that point, one of the things that we've been expanding in the last couple of releases is called Smart Objects. And I can show you how that works with Camera Raw, because it's kind of a cool setup. But basically, what it lets you do is it keeps your layer as a bunch of pixels, like it traditionally is. The thing that makes it different is you're keeping some sort of secret sauce behind the scenes. So in the case of your example with the logo, a lot of people have Photoshop and Illustrator open at the same time. So you might design your logo in Illustrator, you copy, paste it in Photoshop. Well, typically, it would just, it rasterizes it, you got your pixels. And then your boss is like, "Oh, can you make that bigger?" And if you make it bigger, it's going to scale the pixels up and it's going to look bad. Whereas if it had been vector, you'd be fine. So in the past, you'd go back to Illustrator, I open it up again, I copy, paste, And we thought, well, that's kind of lousy. Why don't we just make that a live thing? So now when you paste that, it keeps the vectors behind the scenes, so it stays scalable. So with photographers, I always say anybody's ever worked for a client, the only thing you can count on is that they'll change their minds, right? And so whether or not you get paid, that's not guaranteed, but they're definitely going to change their mind at some point.
Yes.
So keeping things flexible is really key. So layers are part of that. And then people really like working with raw images because you're never touching the original bits. You're always just sort of making instructions that refer to those. Well, now what I can show you is, let me give you an example. And by the way, if you let me keep talking, I'll talk.
I love it.
I'll burn your tape. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Cool, cool.
We could go for 5 hours. Unfortunately,
cool.
I don't have you for 5 hours.
Sure. Yeah, like I say, I mean,
I'm glad Thomas isn't here. We would go for 5 hours.
Oh yeah. Well, it's funny because there've only been a couple products.
We had Jan from PhotoshopOnline.tv at my house one time, and we went for 2 hours.
Oh, I bet, absolutely.
Just covering basics of Photoshop.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there've been only a couple products that really. I remember where I was and what I was doing when I encountered it. I was at my friend's birthday party. I think I was 8 years old, and I saw Mac Paint, and it was like, you know, I'd been used to like black screen, green blinking cursor, ASCII art, and suddenly it was like, I can paint with a brush. And then when I got to college, I was a freshman, I saw Photoshop. I still remember, you know, I think it was a torpedo, you know, I can cut it out. And it was super crude, but I'm like, oh my God. Yeah. And other things, it was like when Mosaic first came out for the web, you know, I called my parents, I said, we looked at something in Czechoslovakia, I can't believe it, you know. And also Flash. So anyway, yeah, I'm just really intrigued by all this stuff. So anyway, just to give a little background, should I describe what a RAW file is in case people don't know, or do people already know?
Well, people who have the $3,000 cameras probably know what it is, but a lot of them don't use it. So like Scott Beal, I know, doesn't use RAW. He saves everything as JPEG, right? And explain what RAW does and why you want to consider working only in RAW.
Sure. So so here's my history major, great books guy explanation. So not the real technical scoop, but basically when your camera, you know, you run the charge through the sensor and it captures the photons hitting it at every point. It has to do some processing to turn that into an image that you can use. And so most of the time, you know, 99 if not 100% of cameras offer the ability to make a JPEG file. And so JPEG, everybody's familiar, you know, looks like a picture, red, green, blue channels. But it's a pretty old format. It's, you know, like early 90s at best. And so it has some limitations. It's a lossy format, so the way it saves size is it throws away some data. It also, when we're talking about bit depth, it's limited to 8 bits. So if your camera has a higher degree of sensitivity and does 10 or 12 or more bits from black to white, the JPEG is going to throw away some of that. So your camera can do what it can on the fly to squash that, to fit, but you're still throwing something away. So the idea with a RAW file is instead of letting your camera do that final step of making the JPEG, you just tell it to stop and just give you the data that was on the sensor at that moment.
And the con to that is your file sizes are huge
comparatively.
To
Yeah,
JPEG.
yeah.
JPEG makes a fairly small size file, but the RAW has all the data.
All the data.
When you get back to Photoshop, you can really play with the image.
Exactly, especially for people who want to, like we were saying, like Ansel Adams, you know, where you really care about the whole tonal range. You know, if space permits on your card and you can shoot a RAW file, you then have the full flexibility to play with that. So there have been a lot of cases, like I shot a seagull on a beach, you know, and it was a pretty bright day, and so his feathers are white, obviously. And, you know, typically that's just going to be all blown out, and it's really solid, and it's not very interesting. But with a RAW file, you can pull back the highlights, and you can actually start seeing some of the details in his feathers. And so it's not, you know, it's like if my mom went to a party with a little, you know, she'd never need a RAW file, who cares? But for people who really want to pull that extra bit of detail out, it's really cool.
Yeah. Well, also JPEG adds artifacts around things, right? So sometimes you'll get a little bit of a weird feathering around hair or something like that.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the quality level. But yeah, I mean, sort of like if you watch, it's like sometimes with like an HD TV and things, you can see this too, like those like weird little blocky artifacts. It's basically the tighter you squeeze the data down, smaller file, but you've had to throw something away.
Now, the people who choose to do JPEG tell me they do it for workflow reasons, that they shoot photography just to put it straight up on Flickr without doing much processing.
Yeah, totally.
Is it possible to bring the images into Photoshop and batch process from RAW to JPEG like that and automatically?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, let me just, so let's say, so I'm just going to cancel out of here, and I'm going to go back to Bridge for a second. So let's say you know, I'm a photographer and I've got, you know, this whole range of shots of this model. Okay, so this is one of the new features in CS3 is you can see multiple images at once in Bridge. So these are all raw files. They're all 22 megapixels from, I think, a Leaf camera back. So what I can do is open them all up in Camera Raw at once. And, you know, I can step through and go image to image. I can, you know, there's tons of things you can do in terms of, you know, changing the temperature, the tint, the exposure, etc. And what I can do when I'm done with these is either open them right in Photoshop, or there's a little save button, and I can actually save them as JPEGs directly. So I can just hit Command S, choose, okay, I want this to be a JPEG, where do I want to put it? And while it's processing from that sort of incomplete form into the final process, I can keep working on my next images.
So you can also do the same process to a batch of images, right?
Yeah, that's what's really cool. So let's say, you know, I've got this whole shoot, and I wanted to take all of these guys, and I wanted to make them all black and white. Well, I could go in here and I could say, convert to grayscale, and bang, they're all black and white. Yeah. Or I could go and I say, I want to do this split tone effect, where it's like black and white, but you actually add a little bit of warmth or a little bit of cool chroma. Well, I've got a preset in here called split tone. I apply that, and if you watch, bang, now they're all split toned. And so that's...
you can undo that too.
Oh yeah, see, the neat thing with the raw files is because they're not RGB channel data, we really can't mess with them at all. So we treat a raw file as a negative, essentially. And you can make a print from it, but you've always got your negative. You know, the downside such as is that you then, you end up with 2 files as opposed to 1, but, you know, hard drives are ridiculously cheap now, and so it's not generally a big deal to back up both. Now, the thing that I mentioned in terms of flexibility in Photoshop, this whole smart objects idea. Yeah. So, you know, I mentioned the case where, okay, I've got something vector, and I want to keep it live behind the scenes and scalable. Well, in this case, let's say we took one of these raw images, and we did this, this sepia sort of split tone effect. I'm going to open it in Camera Raw, or excuse me, in Photoshop. Oh, and by the way, while that's processing, you can see the other one's updating with the new settings. So Bridge is rebuilding the previews for each one. So it took a few seconds, and now I'm in Photoshop, and I've got my file, so I can start to work on it. One of the things that's new in this version of Photoshop is that you can now run filters non-destructively. So what I'm going to do here...
Wait.
Yeah, sorry.
Non-destructively? What do you mean by that?
Okay, good. All right, so this is the thing. There's a spoof on YouTube, this retro encabulator, and I say, it's basically a guy talking like technical gibberish for 2 minutes, and I say, this is what my parents hear when I talk about work. So we can get so conversant, sometimes I forget to you know, clarify what I'm talking about, so I appreciate that. So basically, when we say non-destructive, it's weird because it's almost a double negative, and it's like, the traditional way, it's like, okay, if I open up an image, I take a brush tool and I paint across it. Okay, I've changed those pixels. Yeah. They are changed. Now I can undo it, but if I save it and I open it up again, they are changed. So when we talk about doing things non-destructively, destructive is it's sort of a worse sounding word than it really is. It really should be more about flexibility or being able to change your mind. And so layers are a certain form of non-destructiveness. So I could put up a new layer, I could paint on that, and then I come back the next day and I could just turn that off. And like you say, that's a lot easier than like trying to extract those pixels out of there. There have been cases, though, in Photoshop where you couldn't do something in that non-destructive way. So you couldn't run a filter, let's say, and then 2 weeks later your client's like, well, it's, you know, I said make it blurry, but it's too blurry. Can you unblur it? It's like, no, the pixels are gone. So now, for the first time, you can actually run those and then change your mind later in Photoshop. And so that kind of connects with this whole smart object idea. So let's say, first of all, let's tell Entourage that I'm busy. So what I'm going to do is go under Filter, and let's just let's choose to apply a blur to this image.
Yeah.
Okay. So, you know, maybe we want to do some sort of select.
We could do a whole hour just on blurs, by the way.
Oh, absolutely, right. In fact, that's...
I have no clue what the difference between a Gaussian blur is and a box blur.
I know. And you know what? That's kind of like, when we talk about making Photoshop simpler, that's the poster child. It's like, why do we have... It's like, why do we have blur, blur more, box blur, shape blur, Gaussian blur... You know, smart blur.
Mask.
Yeah, oh yeah, and then sharpening, the same thing. Sharpen, sharpen more, unsharp mask, smart sharpen, sharpen on Tuesday. You know, it's like...
Unsharp mask was one of those, it's like, wait a second, I wanted to sharpen. What's this
I know.
unsharpened mask?
Right, I know. Well, and that's to your point about the traditional darkroom terms. I mean, for me, you know, I kind of came of age with digital cameras. I've never used an unsharp mask, but it's a literal, like, blurry thing that you use and you shoot through it, and it has this weird effect of making stuff sharper. So for a certain generation of photographers, it's like, oh, that's what I would use. For you and me, though, it's like unsharp makes it sharper. So this is where we try to walk a line between like different audiences, you know, who have different vocabularies. So in this case, let's
different sophistications. For instance, when I first used Photoshop and I was trying to brighten or darken something, I would just use brighten or darken, right?
Yes.
Or brighten or...
brightness contrast.
You know, brighten contrast.
Yeah.
And then I went to a Photoshop seminar, and probably somebody like Mike Ninnis or Linda said, no, never use that.
Right.
That's the worst way to brighten an image or raise contrast in an image. Always use curves.
Right. But you know what's funny about that? Because we actually fixed that this time. Because, so just to diverge for a second, we were talking about, okay, if you were totally new, like, sometimes that's hard for us. It's like, come to the app as if you haven't been using it for 15 years, you know, and you're somebody new. It's like, okay, I want to make my image brighter. And you look through the menus, brightness contrast. That's what I want.
Because it's what's on your TV set.
Yeah, well, those are the terms you use. I mean, if I say, ooh, this image isn't, you know, it looks like the levels are wrong, or the curves, like, you know what I mean? You don't say like, oh, it's a levels up day, or so, you know, oh, it's a bright day. You know, so you've got these terms; they make sense.
Yeah.
But the code underneath it was pretty antiquated, and it was useful in some cases. But it was, you know what I mean? You'd go to these seminars, people are like, oh no, you know, like a real user would never do that. So what we did this time is we actually we kept the UI because we said, well, those are the right terms. That's what would be intuitive. Let's just make those commands do something less destructive. And we still have a checkbox if you want to go to the old behavior. If you really relied on that, you can do it. So that's a great example of us going back, and we didn't have to make the app more complicated or add any new menu items. We just took something that existed and made it work, you could argue, properly now, or in a more modern way.
Right.
So that's what we're doing.
We could do a whole hour on on both of those things.
Totally,
and brightening,
totally.
Making your images, you know, better contrast and better brightness.
Exactly.
Jen Kabelia at Photoshop Online TV does sessions just on that, you know, or Linda.
Sure. Oh, there's a book Bruce Fraser wrote, Real World Sharpening. And we were starting to tease him about it. It's like, is there going to be real world open dialogue and like real world save checkbox? You know, because I mean, you literally could write a book about each of these little areas of the product. But just to, no, it's okay.
We have 10 minutes left.
Sure, no worries. So just really briefly, in this example, what I've done is I took a raw file.
Yeah.
I set some settings on it. I brought it into Photoshop as a smart object, which I'll explain sort of why that's useful in a second. And then I applied a blur on it. Okay. So what's cool, and these are the parts that are new in CS3, is if I go in and I say, well, I want it blurry, but only in some parts. You know, I basically, maybe I want her torso blurry, but I want her face to be in focus.
Right.
So what I'm doing is I'm using the bracket keys. I'm making my brush really big. And I'm setting it down to like 50% opacity. And what I'm doing, there's a little mask over here on the smart filter. So the mask determines where is the filter applied and where is it hidden. So as I paint the two areas, it'll either hide or show the effects. And so if I go and click on her face, what you can see, it's very tiny on my screen, but basically as I'm adding black dots here, if I show those, these are the dots I'm adding. The effect of those is that's saying, okay, hide the filter in those spots. So you can see those are the areas where her face is now in focus.
Oh, that's really neat.
Cool, yeah. And then what's cool is this box blur. I could always turn it off. You can see everything is in focus underneath.
Yeah.
And I can turn it back on. And if I decide, well, maybe it's too intense, I just double click it, and the parameters come back up, and I could ratchet it down. I could say, well, let's try that as a 10, or let's try it as a a 30 or something like that. So you've really got a lot of flexibility in there. Now, the reason I mentioned the smart object thing is, well, what if you've done all this work, and then your client's like, well, that's great, but you know what, the split tone thing's not working. I want a full color image. Well, it's like, traditionally, I got to go back to my raw file, reprocess it, rebring it in, reapply the blur, redo all that stuff. Okay, I'm back. But wouldn't it be nice if you could just change those raw settings without any hassle?
Yeah.
So the idea now is that I've brought this in as a smart object. I just double click it, and it's going to launch Camera Raw again. There's my image.
Yeah.
And I could go back and apply any settings I want. So I'm just going to set it back to the defaults and hit OK. And the raw file is actually embedded in Photoshop. It reprocesses it, and now it updates.
Wow.
Right? So basically I've taken my negative, essentially, and I've put that inside the Photoshop file. And so I can keep it totally intact. I can keep all of the adjustments around it intact, and I can update the two things independently.
That's killer.
Cool. Thank you.
That's killer.
That was
saved me a lot of time.
Cool. And so this, it's funny because I'm super impatient, and I know, and we all know where we're going, where it's like we want an environment of total flexibility, and non-destructiveness is another way of saying that. And it's a sort of a marathon instead of a sprint. So this is, it's another step on that road, but it's a big step. And so, the more things we can do, that it's sort of a no-brainer. Then the more creative flexibility you've got down the road.
In just a couple of minutes, are there 3 other things that are new in Photoshop? Just real
yes,
fast.
Absolutely. So so let me show you the auto align stuff, because it's really pretty cool. So
just real fast.
You got it.
We're running out of
super
time.
quick. Okay, it's the grand world tour. Okay, so everybody's gone through this. You take a group shot, right?
Yeah.
You got some people are smiling, they look great, looking at the camera, but other people aren't. So okay, you take a second shot, and okay, great, now this girl's looking at the camera, this guy's looking, but now this guy's not smiling, right? And so you don't have one shot that's got everybody doing what you want.
Right.
So what you can do, and you'll notice here as I click between these two photos, they're not lined up properly. What I can do is just select both of them. I go under the Edit menu, new option called Auto Align Layers.
Show me that option again.
Oh, sure.
Right.
It's under Edit,
yeah.
And there's a new command called Auto Align Layers.
Okay.
And when I do that, and I hit OK, Photoshop thinks for a few seconds. And now, when I toggle between those two layers, you can see they're perfectly lined up.
Wow.
And so what's cool about that is I could go in and add a layer mask, just like I did with that woman where I wanted to mask out the filter. But in this case, I'm just going to mask out these pixels. And okay, say I want you to look at the camera, right? And so what I'm doing is hiding the version of this woman on one layer and showing her on the other. And in the case with this guy, I just want to go and paint on his head, and like so, hide that. And so very quickly, that's before and that's after. Wow. So by lining up the two layers, I was able to then very easily blend them. And give you one other quick example of how that's cool. I'm going to just use my scripts here to load up a couple images. Bear with me 1 second. So I'm going to take these 4 JPEGs and load these guys up and hit OK.
Right.
There's actually an automated way to do what I'm about to show you, but it's a little bit clearer sometimes when I do it manually.
Okay.
So what I'm going to do is, it's taking 4 JPEGs, it's building them into a stack of layers inside Photoshop. And so I can look at these guys. Okay, it's kind of, all right, got them. I select these things. Now sometimes just aligning them doesn't do enough. So let's take a look at what happens. So I choose my options, I hit OK, thinks about it. Okay, now it aligned them, but you can see there's some pretty obvious flaws. So the exposure changed from image to image. So this is kind of screwy looking. And it didn't really perfectly align it in some spots. So I wouldn't bring this up if I didn't have a solution, right? So, so next to auto align, there's a command called auto blend. So I choose that.
Auto blend layers.
Let it run, and bang. There's the result, right? So
and you can't see any difference.
So there's exactly. So there's before, and there's after.
Wow.
Right. So it went and it corrected this area where the exposure was kind of screwy, and also in spots like this window, you can see where it wasn't lining up properly. It actually is additionally adjusted it to line up.
Wow.
And
so
then
this means you can do really neat panoramic
absolutely
shots with 300 images or something.
Yeah.
Them all together.
In fact, on my blog, and I can give you some links to this. I've taken, I've got this 8 megapixel Canon. So I went on top of the Adobe office in Paris and shot a bunch of shots, stitched them together, made I think like 35,000 pixel wide panorama, blended them together, then exported using this thing called Zoomify, which basically puts out a high-res image onto the web, and then you can view it through Flash, and it brings in the pieces on demand. And that's again new in CS3. So it's basically taking the automatic alignment and blending plus the Adobe and Macromedia stuff together, and you've got something totally new as a result. So you can actually put incredibly high-res stuff on the web now directly out of Photoshop via Flash.
Any other things?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
We could go for hours, can't we?
I know we could. I don't know if there's anything. Oh, okay. If you got one, well, I got to show you one thing. Okay, the disappearing tourists.
One last thing.
All right, one last thing. One last thing. So one more time, I'm going to go in and I'm just going to use that same script, and I'm going to load up some files again into a stack. And in this case, these are some images taken by a photographer named Martin Evening. He's a really great writer and photographer in the UK. And what happens if you've ever been on vacation, I'm sure you've seen this, where you take a bunch of shots of something and you can never get one where there's not some person or pigeon, or something walking through the frame, right?
Right.
So what you can do in Photoshop now is select all these layers, and I'm going to choose these and auto align them. Just choose auto. Okay. It's going to look again for any common elements, so the trees, the background, the fountain. So now you can see, okay, now those are perfectly lined up. And again, there's a script that does all this in one click, but I'm just doing kind of manually. Make this into a smart object, so they're all stacked into one nested thing. And then at the end, under smart objects, there's a thing called stack mode. I'm going to choose median, and watch what happens. Bang. So, before, you had tourists and moving objects, and after, they've disappeared. So what median is doing is looking for common pixels. So it only wants to keep the stuff that's there at least half the time. So if anything is sort of moving through, whether it's a person or whether it's noise off your camera sensor, it's going to blow that away. And so now, this is actually a Photoshop CS3 extended feature. There are 2 flavors of Photoshop now. Okay. You can stack things up and then run median and actually delete the moving elements.
Very cool.
Cool, yeah.
Very cool. Well, thanks. I got to come back for the longer Photoshop edition.
All right, Robert. Well, it's been fun having you.
We can go more into depth on sharpening.
Anytime,
fun with curves and fun with histograms.
Yeah, that's right.
We haven't gotten into any of that stuff.
No, but hey, this is why I blog. I've got a lot to say. So, and I know you know the feeling. So, but yeah, you're welcome anytime.
Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you.